All right, here we are again.
Yay.
Uh, Lxxxv and Gabe and I are going to talk today again about the mental obsession, but more so the concept that there is not only a solution, but it is our own insistence that there be a problem. And that insistence, in my experience, is an attempt to make believe that I have control over all of reality because I've been thinking incorrectly about reality and feel threatened by the thinking I'm doing, not actual reality. So this induced state of insanity, which would be seeing and hearing things that aren't happening, like talking to a self that doesn't exist and thinking to a self that doesn't exist, as though I'm thinking to a self that's seemingly separate from me, would be an induced state of insanity in my experience. And that creation happens when I think my thinking is reality, and that whatever I think is true, and I need to defend that for my life when the life I'm thinking about is this induced persona that I've created that I call myself, rather than recognize that I, as the thinker, I am the self ultimately based on the capacity I have to choose my thoughts
Mhm.
freely. So that
Mhm.
freedom is my nature. The choices I make often give me the impression that I'm condemned. So, Gabe, there was a point yesterday. Gabe and I did a walk yesterday on the beach. There was a point yesterday that you were thinking about for today.
Yeah, we talked a lot yesterday, but the fear component we talked about yesterday was the fear of not the consequences or the actual possibility, but the fear you're experiencing now by the bad thinking. Um,
Right.
so maybe you could expand on that.
Well, and my sense is that the fear, the conflicts, the drama, the seeming impossibility, the anxiety, the stress, the pressure, the depression, all of those are components of awareness. So if I'm experiencing those and I'm thinking I don't know what's going on, I'm denying the experience I'm having by thinking it isn't mine, it shouldn't be there. I'm thinking of them as things that shouldn't be happening while they're happening. You follow me?
Yeah.
So if I'm taking a position that what's happening shouldn't be happening, that's a major conflict immediately. So what do I experience? Inner conflict, emotional turmoil, mental anguish. That isn't reality. This is simply a choice I'm making to affect my mentality. And as Lensis said before we got on, create this seeming stuckness and blockedness that isn't reality. It's being created by a thought that isn't true, thought of as truth and reality. So
Mhm.
my sense is, I mean, in sobriety, we talk about self-centered fear. Well, if I think thinking of my thinking, so if I think thinking of thinking itself becomes myself, and I've been thinking my thinking is reality, that self-centered fear is the fear of the creation I've made, this manifestation I've created that I call myself, that isn't myself. It's simply my thinking, simply a choice I'm thinking about. And then thinking that by thinking about it, I create a self, I become the creator of reality. And the fear is natural because I know that it's undermining my capacity to actually function and survive. So the fear, again, just like the anxiety, the stress, the depression, the conflict, the emotional turmoil, the mental anguish, are all evidence of something I am thinking that is wrong. So it's
Mhm.
my dashboard. And if I'm driving a car and the oil light goes on and I think it's an inconvenience to face it, the great inconvenience is going to be continuing to drive. That's going to have a dramatic impact compared to stopping and getting a quart of oil, right? We're going to wear out our systems. Our circumstances are going to start to get worn out. We're going to say we're sick and tired, but apparently we're not tired enough not to continue. We may be sick, but not tired enough if we're continuing to do this repetitively. It's just simply an incorrectness of thinking about our thinking. Thinking is imagined, it's a concept, a narrative, a story we develop to give the imagery of that thinking we're thinking about reality, and so we're looking at as reality, but it isn't reality. It's what we're thinking about reality. Reality is always complete and whole, so we don't need to think about it for it to be complete and whole. So any division I create by thinking it's what I think, I all of a sudden start suffering to the degree that I make believe it's truth rather than see that it's just imagination. I'm writing a script. I'm a screenwriter or a playwright writing a script in my thinking about a story that I'm developing. There's nothing wrong with that until I start thinking that this fantasy I've created is reality. So if the fear is evidence and I'm acting acting as though the best thing I can do is to deny it and pretend it isn't evidence and pretend that it has nothing to do with me, so I need to just feel better about it, get over it. I'm literally becoming desensitized to my experience. And I'm claiming the best thing I can do is not exist. I'm literally arguing in favor of non-existence because numbness would be the exact opposite of what a sentient being is designed to do, which would be sensitive to its awareness. And our bodies are filled with sensation naturally, and they don't have opinions. The opinion is what I do with that. Same as what I'm thinking about reality, I'm doing with the sensations that I'm getting from my body, and I'm deciding what they are. And generally speaking, my experience is if I'm listening to my thinking, it's telling me accurately, even if I'm thinking insane thoughts, it's telling me accurately about those thoughts. So when I feel wrong, my thought's wrong. If I feel bad, my thought's bad. So if you think about that, those aren't emotions. Those are simply feeling what's happening. Feeling guilty is not an emotion. It's feeling the guilt I have for doing what I'm doing. Feeling shame is not an emotion. It's the shame I have for trying to pretend my thoughts are reality when in fact I am absolutely in the grace of all reality all the time.
It's hard to say that you're in the grace of reality when your child dies, when, something happens, you feel that those are expressions of reality as they are, and that there's no discontent to be expected of those.
No, I don't. My sense is that the actual experience of humanity becomes much clearer, and the drama isn't an over dramatization, but an actualization of the experience. And that experience doesn't disappear, and all of a sudden I become numb to it. It's interesting that since addiction is thinking backward about things, like a lie is the idea that truth is false or false is truth, as though the two can be separated, when in fact the opposite of something infinite would be the same as something infinite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if there's an infinite nature, there's something going on here that we're misreading about life, so we're probably not thinking about death too well. And my experience is whenever I'm finding that turmoil is seemingly insurmountable and reality, I am mistaking my thinking for being reality rather than seeing that this isn't a surprise. Death, in terms of our experience, isn't a surprise at all. It isn't shocking. It's actually guaranteed at birth. And yet we celebrate birth and seem to dread death. The only way to avoid death would be to avoid birth. We don't seem to think that. We don't think in those complete terms because we think opposite can be opposite and remain. If matter, as you know, Gabe, is pulled, is if opposites attract, it's because there's a gravitational pull naturally for matter, right?
Mm-hmm.
If what seems to matter to me is my thought that I think is real, it becomes all that matters. So I ignore the things that are actually happening in my experience because it would discount what that absolute pure idea I have about something that's absolutely wrong, that addictive idea I have, thinking that there's nothing else going on but the consuming nature of this intoxication of my thought. So to see the opposites as the same rather than if I say that I am creating reality, I am also simultaneously saying that reality doesn't exist. Because I can't be creating it. If reality is reality, it isn't shy of being real. It doesn't have any hole in it that needs to be filled by my thinking. Follow?
I follow. It just doesn't. I think like let's just stay on the death scenario. You recently experienced the passing of someone. I did a few years ago. These are sorrowful things, sort of naturally feeling sorrowful, like naturally
Right.
feel loss.
Yes.
And I would, extrapolate these to anxiety, stress, pain, fear, all that other stuff. But let's stick with death. Like these are the natural consequence of loss, of losing someone or something. You do feel loss and some emptiness.
I
Those are
also feel that when I lose my keys.
No, you don't. Come on.
I do.
You don't feel a sense of emptiness and void.
I feel gripped. I feel ashamed. I feel regretful. I feel all of the things that I seem to attribute to that person now that doesn't seem to be here in relation to the things I did or didn't do and could have done and should have done and might have done. And it's pretty much that same cycle. I'm not trying to minimize the death experience, because my sense is that actually facing death accurately is the window to seeing life clearly. And it's not happening because it's not something we are designed to be able to do. It's something we're actually given as a window into that awareness.
So you losing your keys is also a window?
Yes. Yeah.
He has to use the window to get in when he loses his keys.
Yeah.
Well, and the idea is that if I was the last one to have my keys and I think I lost them, think of that. I'm normally the one that put them wherever they are that I think I lost them. There's obviously a numbness to my thinking and my awareness that isn't being helpful in that case. It's creating a bit of drama. So with my daughter, one of the processes that I went through was initially seeing, in the initial days, I felt very, very sad. But I began to realize that largely what I was sad about is what I thought should have happened, could have happened, would have happened, might have happened, etc. It had nothing to do with her at all. It had everything to do with my thoughts about her. And then I started thinking, well, what if I just thought about her? And then I realized that there were a lot of components to her that were both acceptable and unacceptable at points, very difficult and very amazing. And I started seeing her in a very balanced view and started actually relating to her as she was rather than as I preferred her as being and thinking and all that. And toward the end of that first week, I woke up one morning and I had this thought of what a spectacular transition she has made. She has done this thing that we often worry about. She's accomplished that. She's there. She doesn't wonder now. She knows. And in her voice, she used to say to me, whenever I would come to terms with something that she was learning as a younger generation, and I sort of said, "Oh, I see what you're saying." She'd say, "Go, Dad." Like I'm finally catching on. And I heard those words clear as a bell in my brain. Now, that may just be recollection, but the fact was it was something confirming that there was still something going on that wasn't gone, that was very much alive, that was very much present, and maybe worth noticing in our own experience of thinking about death is that a body is designed to transform and disintegrate. And yet the essence of that body never leaves this universe. The elements are always here. And the same thing that made people up before they were born is the same thing that is left behind once they seemingly die in their physical form. I'm not trying to discount at all. The clarity of this has allowed me to process emotion in relation to it like I've never been able to do in my life. I've always often ignored it and denied it, just like I ignore and deny my own painful present experience often, thinking somehow I'll get better if I pretend it's not there. And it's kind of a profound way to deal with it because it's actually seeing the totality of even my present experience. And my question always is, why do we think we need to die to rest in peace? Very interesting. Why is it that we feel so turbulent? People who have near-death experiences, when they start to realize they're going back into their body, generally do not want to come back into the body. They've known this perfect peace. They have this sense of wholeness, this sense of place, this sense of home. It's very interesting that while we're here, we don't seem to have that. We seem to always be looking for it. So it may be the basic thinking we're doing about things in parts rather than in the whole, and seeing the parts as the whole might give us an intuitive, meaning clear indication of what's happening that's beyond reason rather than only within the thinking we can do to become reasonable.
Yeah, so let's get back to that fear and that geology thing you mentioned yesterday too.
The what? The geology?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The and I can relate it in space-time as well. Like if space curves based on, on relativity only, not quantum, but like space-time bends upon how much mass and energy is collected into
Right.
something. So when you're making mass and energy, you think you're bending space and time, but you're operating on a completely different set of coordinates. So
Well,
everything
and
is going
to
to
your
be
point,
shaky, and it's going to be off balance, and it's going to be wrongly, equations don't work, and that's exactly what a panic attack feels like. Everything
but
is off. It's
because you think you're in it while you're doing it.
yeah, well, doing it in it like you're operating on a basis that is literally unfounded.
Right. So think of that. It's unfound because it can't be found.
Yeah,
It's literally an illusion.
yeah. There's no foundation, there's no math, there's no matter, and you're in a wobbly space time warp. And that's exactly what a panic attack feels like. Time slows down, like your breathing is off, you're shaking, you're crying, you're whatever, vomiting, like everything is just seasickness, dizziness, whatever, like you're off. This is in my experience.
Yes. Yeah.
All these
Well, and
things.
it feels that way, doesn't it, Gabe?
Yeah, it feels very much that way. Yes.
So if you think you're alone, you're going to feel alone. And if you think you're alone and feel disconnected, what you're feeling is the disconnected nature of the thought that you're alone, not the fact that you're alone. So to think within thinking, consider this. Could we feel wobbly if we didn't know stability?
Yeah, you couldn't. You wouldn't. Well, you wouldn't know how to describe it.
Exactly. Because you wouldn't be thinking about it. You would think it's natural. So natural is that there's nothing to think about. So if we're thinking about it, maybe it's the thinking creating the wobbliness based on, it's kind of like a teeter-totter. Teeter-totter does not teeter and totter because it's on wobbly ground. It teeters and totters because it's on solid ground. Same with the pendulum. Pendulum does not go back and forth between good and bad like it seems to if it weren't based on stability. Couldn't happen.
Right. No, I'm confirming what we talked about yesterday and what you're saying. It's like you're making up matter, and so you're warping your own space-time.
Exactly. And what's interesting is we think what matters matters when it's literally an illusion of thought creating mass, and the mass is actually seeming real when in fact it's imagined. So the effect we're having is based on imagination. And if it's imagined, why is it that we think we can't imagine it's not real?
Say that again before.
If it's based on imagination, why do we think it's real?
Because our thoughts like to think.
The what?
Our thoughts like to think. Our ego, like you said yesterday, the ego is made up of this. And
thinking the thoughts are real is why we think those things matter and are reality, rather than realizing the thoughts are imagined and they're manifesting effects that are giving us impressions. And the longer we make believe those impressions are reality, the more depressed we get over maintaining them. Our bodily systems And those responses that we're having, those experiences that we're having, that we're thinking we need to feel better about and get over, are actually our dashboard giving us direction, which is both announcing that we know what's going on, and at the same time, we're acting as though we don't, thinking what the best thing we can do is feel better about it and try to get over it. We must think there's something there to feel better about and get over, to think of it as something we can leave behind or change by not paying attention to what's happening. If you follow that, if I said that correctly.
Yeah. It kind of leads to, like, is there a third actor here that's flipping the switch between thoughts and reality? Is there a third?
I'm the third actor. That's me.
Well, that's what we call ego. Ego, as I said to you, I think yesterday, isn't some strange confluence of us that acts out occasionally in these flagrant ways. Ego is every thought we have that we think is reality, every false thought we have that we think is true, probably better described. So if my thought is that my thinking is reality, then the fundamental basis of my thinking is incorrect. And everything that's going to come from that is going to be corrupted and seem as though it's something I need to get over and feel better about, which is what resolution is compared to dissolution, when you begin to see that there is no reality in it. They're just thoughts about reality that we're struggling with. And that struggle is helping us define reality in terms of the laws of nature. How do we operate in the most beneficial, productive, efficient, effective manner in relation to reality? That's what it's giving us, this guidance system to narrow our focus to things that actually work and produce benefits, that once we perform on that basis, everyone around us, everyone near us, everyone begins to see that there's a way to operate that requires very, very little thinking, because every time you apply that thing, it works.
There's no
Just
fun.
like the basics of mathematics. Once we learned that, we didn't go back and have to relearn the basics every time to come to a conclusion. We just knew, we knew. Knowing doesn't involve a lot of thinking. And I would say in the absolute knowing nature of any absolute knowing, there is no thinking, because it already knows everything. What would it be thinking about? Most of our choices are trying to adjust our experience to have a better experience, while we're denying the experience we're having and getting better at thinking worse about it. Thinking feeling better all the time is the goal, is not noticing what's worse and ignoring it and thinking that it isn't happening because I've turned my back to it. That's a major problem in thought.
Why is it so easy then to revert back to that? Why is it seemingly, if it's unstable, unbased, unfounded, it seems very easy to jump back into those
Well,
ego-driven thoughts?
My sense is we've made it seem so common, and everyone seems to do it. So we think that as long as everyone's in the same rut, we might as well be there too. It seems preposterous to imagine that any of us individually have the freedom to begin to notice that the thing that seems to condemn us has no basis in reality at all, and we are absolutely capable of being free in that regard, while we're witnessing so much decay and diversion and perversion in the thinking going on around us. We don't have a lot of experience with it, Gabe. We don't have a lot of practice. So when circumstances all of a sudden we talked about this yesterday too, when circumstances overwhelm my expectations, which are really just overwhelming the limits of my thinking, I think what I need to do is jump back in and start defending my thoughts, because I think my life is at risk, when in fact, the thought is any limited thought is always the beginning of everything else in terms of knowing and awareness and all the things we could learn. It's not the end of anything. But to think of it reactively is to think I'm in it, I need to defend it because my life depends on it. Now the persona that I have, made up of all these characterizations that I've defined as to who I am, because I think now I'm defined by definition rather than an essence that's completely indefinable, becomes something I got to protect. So the present awareness of this doesn't discount the potential for us to continue doing it. It gives us the potential to start seeing what we're doing accurately. And what I've realized is that I have a lot of pitiful thoughts, a lot of petty thoughts, a lot of spite, a lot of seeming contempt, and none of those things are for the people I'm thinking about. They're all coming from the self I still think I am, and imagine all of those things to be elsewhere rather than here now and what I'm doing. It's sort of an inconvenient truth. Seemingly.
Mhm.
You know, it's kind of like when the oil light comes on. It's an inconvenience, right? But nothing's going to be convenient about ignoring it. And yet we continue and we continue and we continue and we continue thinking, literally thinking, Gabe, it's the only thing we can do. It's all we've ever done. It's the only thing we can do. Well, if all I've ever done is one thing, that means all other things are still perfectly capable of being done. It's actually proof of more, but in the thinking, it seems to prove less. So I think one of the points yesterday about the geology that was interesting was that, you know, we talk about building a foundation, having a firm foundation, so any structure we built on it is firm and solid. And what's interesting about a firm foundation is if you have a perfectly firm foundation and there's any weakness in the structure, you know it's not the foundation, but it's the structure. Right?
Right.
So if you build a firm foundation on geology that's weak, then that foundation, no matter how firm it is going to be faulty. And I would say that really reflects the idea that our thinking about thinking is on firm ground, when in fact thinking is always changing. So the ever-changing nature of it isn't firm at all. It's a constant quicksand, per se. It's an always ever-present drowning pool potential. And yet that would be the reversal of its purpose, which would be to think aligned with reality so we could operate in ways that were naturally productive and beneficial and efficient and effective. So to see it incorrectly is to act incorrectly on it. Think we're building a foundation, forgetting that the geology is critical to that foundation, as you know, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of the first things you do is a geological report on a piece of land to see what's under the ground, what's under there. What would that be? Substance, beneath where we stand. Understanding, beneath where we're standing. Beneath the positions we take. We're looking for what's the underlying essence of this ground. Is it liquefaction? Is it rocky? Is it mixed? When I redid my house, they had brought all the roadkill, I called it, all the debris from the roads that were being built in the neighborhood and used it as the foundation for the floor. So when we started looking at it, the guy said, we got to take all this out because it creates an incredible variation of stability in the basis of the building. So we took 18 inches of all that crap out of there and refilled it with new, consistent, I forget what they called it, but it was a different kind of, might have been crushed granite or something, but it was small enough that it could be consistent across the board so that I didn't have variation where you get those elevation cracks over time. You might get cracks, but they don't separate and create little trip and fall type situations because you got a solid basis down there. If our basis is solid in an infinite sense, and we're thinking of it is only in relative terms, we're limiting our experience to our thoughts that are constantly in motion and wondering why the emotion of our experience feels bad and difficult.
But even knowing all of our talks, those emotions still grab hold sometimes.
Yeah, it's not to say they shouldn't or can't. It's to say, yes, they can and will. To see them clearly isn't to engage them in further dereliction, but start to say, oh, if I feel conflicted, I'm thinking something conflicted, and begin to actually exercise accurately and honestly my interaction as something that is potentially going to be reactive or proactive in terms of learning. If I'm learning to get worse, I'm learning to turn reactivity into feeling better and trying to get over things. If I'm learning to get better, I'm starting to live with and say, wow, this can be very disturbing. This disturbance is something, what I learned is that I'd been living with my whole life, thinking somehow or another life was about getting over it and getting away from it because it felt so disturbing. But to the degree that I thought getting over it and feeling better about it was the answer, I continued to maintain it and create it and manifest it in my thinking. I continued to think of it as real, to think of it as something that I could get over or feel better about. Until I started realizing this is all fantasy, but I must be taking it seriously enough to think it's still real. And even in the midst of that understanding, I begin to see that I don't quite understand it in terms of all my activities, and my circumstances are giving me an opportunity to notice that overwhelm when I experience it and either diminish the impact of it by thinking it shouldn't be happening, or begin to grow and realize if it's happening, it's happening, and it might be worth admitting as it is and living with it that way. Now I'm not reactive to it. I'm learning to actually diffuse it, because the anxiety and the stress and the pressure and all the things that I have maintained to get to the point where I think the only thing I can do is the desperate thing because I've been desperate for so long, begins to allow inspiration to be seen clearly as the source of absolute awareness rather than the source of thinking about thinking's awareness. So I'm no longer in my thinking, I'm just seeing it as something I'm doing. And so instead of it being universal, it's become something I'm doing in my own brain with what I have. I have a body, I have a brain, I have thoughts, I make those choices. To think that they're everything that's going on is to really dismiss everything that's going on. It can seem perplexing, can't it?
Well, perplexing that it can look, I've come miles, eons from where I was 2 years ago, but it still pitter patters around up there in my noggin.
So I'm going to give you mine too, Gabe. Mine too. I don't talk about this because I don't do it. I talk about it because I want to get better.
Yeah.
Literally. My sense is when I started looking, I started seeing things clearly, and I started seeing how pitiful that condition was. And it was well beyond what I imagined was even possible. Because obviously, if I was thinking impossible thoughts, I certainly wasn't thinking about possibility. I was constantly focused on impossibility. So I saw impossibility is the only possibility, rather than start to see the impossibility accurately, and it starts to disperse and diffuse and dissolve, literally, not becoming something to get better at feeling isn't there, but start to realize it isn't there, and it diffuses, and the pressure goes, and the bodily sensations start to relax. But in doing that, that abyss, that seeming abyss, becomes clearer to any degree I'm continuing to do it. So the smaller things I do seem to be bigger because I'm looking at them clearly, while those biggest things I used to chronically do are gone. I don't do those things that way anymore, and yet it doesn't mean I'm not doing some of those things in the way I'm doing it now. So seeing it clearly can often feel incredibly disturbing, because it would seem like I'd already gotten over this, but I got over it in relation to other circumstance. And right now, everything that's happening is happening. And if I'm thinking of it any differently, I'm thinking what happened should resolve what's happening now, while I'm trying to not be involved in what's going on now. I'm once again trying to ignore it, think that ignorance is bliss, and it's my only goal. When I'm actually arguing in favor of non-existence, desensitization, not being available for comment. Well, if I wasn't, I wouldn't be debating it. I wouldn't be struggling with it. I mean, the insidious nature of beginning to see it is beginning to see irony at the source of all these things. And it isn't even ironic. We've used irony to twist it in ways that seem completely perverted as normality. And to become cognizant of that being my responsibility and my creation and my choices is to eliminate all other conflicts other than the ones I'm creating. And if you want to look at fear, that's the way to actually see it and diffuse it, rather than maintain it and think it's something you can ignore. Because by ignoring it, all I'm doing is maintaining it and thinking it's not there. So it's building and building and building. And that pressure I feel, I'm afraid of, because I know it is not helping my cause at all. My body is actually disintegrating while I'm making believe I'm doing the only thing I can and the healthiest thing I can. It's literally a perversion, another version, a contrary version of a story. It's not reality. It's just a story I'm told that's sick. And so there's no ethical, moral basis for it. So repeating it is immorality, incomprehensible immorality, what would it be? Illogical. It's incomprehensible.
No, let's take it further. You're literally going to be pouring gasoline on it in the form of scotch.
Yeah. But that's the demoralization, the demoralization, incomprehensible demoralization that we talk about is really admitting the demoralization of the thinking, which is immorality. The essence of immorality is not breaking the 10 commandments. It's seeing that those commandments only existed because the thinking was so corrupt, we thought those things were solutions. Coveting what other people had, killing other people, stealing, all that stuff are corruptions of the thinking, to think that we have so little that we need what everybody else has, rather than see we've already got everything everyone else has, and we already share a nature that's absolutely shared between us, and that there's no lack in that. The lack is in my thinking. The scarcity is in my thinking. And talk about fear. Think of the word scarcity. It's like a city of fear.
Yeah.
I had a friend who grew up in the ghetto, and his mother used to say to him, the worst neighborhood you live in is between your ears.
That's a good point.
And I thought that was pretty brilliant, to be in a neighborhood that obviously had plenty of fears, but his mother was clear enough to know that he created it, she created it, and she was willing to share that with him when he was young. And he came to realize that my mother knew. She'd look at me and say, you're up to something. And I would deny it, and she would know absolutely she was on the right path as soon as I did. What are you thinking? What's gotten into you? Who do you think you are? All those things are very good questions when it comes to making believe who I am is what I think. And as a result, misbehave and corrupt my capacity to benefit others. So I inflict pain and suffering and all sorts of other things, thinking it's the only thing I can do. And not only that, thinking they deserve it because I'm blaming them at the same time. It's interesting how we seem to see what's wrong in the world so clearly while we're struggling with our own disturbing, disoriented sense of self. So if in an infinite sense or concept, infinite is our geology, is the essence of our foundation, and that's the foundation. It's both the geology and the foundation and the essence of knowledge. It's an omniscient, omnipotent, all-knowing sense. That sense in our human experience is the absolute peace, the resting in peace, wherever we are, and noticing it's always there. And that's what's actually giving us the contrast of disturbance that we're witnessing. If it weren't for that knowing nature, we wouldn't notice the disturbance, like you said earlier, Gabe. It would just be so natural, we wouldn't think about it. We would just think it's nature. It's just something we do. That's it. We wouldn't think of it in the terms of this. We wouldn't have the ability to actually critique it, because we'd simply be operating on it just like we do now with respect to things we know to do immediately and accurately, especially in the face of a threat. We seem to know exactly what to do to avoid it. Run, fight, flight, all those natural instincts in addiction are turned exactly against us. So the things we're doing by running is to create the problem we think we're running from. It's internal rather than something external we can get away from. So to think I can get away from something I'm creating is to live with it chronically and wonder why it keeps happening. So our discussion is about lying to the self. It isn't about lying to the self. It's starting to see that the self we've been promoting is a lie. And it's filled with fear by nature because it isn't who we are, and we're operating on that basis, and it's threatening our human existence. And you can see the manifestation of it worldwide in the things we've done as solutions turning into long-term problems that we have no idea how to solve, and keep thinking because they haven't gotten as bad as they possibly can that they're never going to. It's very much exactly what an addict or anybody who's got a compulsion basically thinks they're better and better and better by doing more and more and more of the wrong thing, when in fact their tolerance becomes less tolerable. So they have to do more and more and more of that thing to overcome the growing intolerance in their experience. And that's what leads to overdoses and suicide. This idea that I can't take it anymore because we've been dishing it out, thinking it has nothing to do with us. It does. And to think of it in any lesser terms than accurately is to think of it in terms that are inaccurate, thought to be accurate. So it's this whole internal, seemingly self-imposed exile into motion, where there's no self in it at all. The self is a being that's never stuck in a thought because it's a knowing nature that we all have. It allows the pendulum to swing and the teeter to totter. So those aren't things we shouldn't or can't do. There are things we're going to do when it comes to our human experience. A guy walking a tightrope is seldom in balance, but in balance enough to maintain his place on that narrow little razor's edge in space. This can be very disturbing to start to face, because by facing it is starting to notice you've been facing it all along while thinking you could avoid it. And to see the lie is to really come to terms with this seeming self that seems hard to face, because we make that whole thing up while we've been facing all of the consequences of it, many of us for decades, thinking they weren't there, thinking desensitization was our goal, numbing ourselves was our goal. That's an argument for non-existence, the suicidal tendency. To constantly try to feel better about it is to do compulsive actions that are never healthy for us. No compulsive action is healthy because sick thoughts lead to compulsive act. Always. And every obsessive thought you have is connected to a compulsive act. Every one of them. You can think otherwise, but it's not wise. And wisdom is the ultimate intuition to begin to notice that we have a knowing nature, or we would not be experiencing those disturbing effects. We're disturbed. Feeling wrong is beginning to actually learn from the wrong rather than thinking it's something that we need to right by overcoming it and denying it and trying to feel better than. We're going into a classroom where the curriculum, we're thinking the best we can do is pretend we know everything when we're not learning anything. So there's no chance we're moving forward into the next lesson, the next lesson. The lesson is that I'm learning to get better at denial. Denial is psychic anesthesia. That is not learning in any healthy way. It's learning to be sicker and infect other people with that same contagion and give them the impression it's the only thing they can do because it's the only thing we're doing. Once again, they're confirmed in their own insanity, this induced insanity. So, Gabe, to the degree that you're seeing that clearly and seeing it as something that seems a little bit odd to keep doing, if I'm defining your responses today accurately, and that's kind of a question, but
Oh yeah, yes.
okay.
No, I've come a million miles, but things have.
Well, and I was going to say, seeing it that way, you can see the growth by the fact that you're even looking.
Yeah.
When I was looking to get away all the time, I was looking to get away with something, but think about that. If I'm trying to get away from a bear, that's possible. But if the bear is imagined in my thinking like a dream or a nightmare and I'm running away from it, I'm taking the thing with me everywhere I go. Yeah. I've created the experience and it always seems to end up where I am. No matter what I do, I keep seeming to find it and ask, why does this keep happening? Why do I keep going through this? Why? Because I'm repeatedly reinforcing the idea that that is truth, and I know truth to be real and not changing. So I have to imagine that thought I have can't change either. If it's truth, it can't change. So the sick thought becomes the only thing I can do. And that's a very good definition of addiction at its core, not the compulsive nature, because the compulsive nature, again, splits off into every compulsion that's possible. And there's, within the 12-step program, 150, 200 different programs, probably more, dealing with symptoms. This is talking about the disease, the mental aspect, the central cause. My sense, it's been going on in humanity as long, there were periods of time, you probably know more of these than I do, Gabe, but we thought we were at the center of the universe because we looked out at the universe from the world.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? We thought because we were at the center, that put us at the center of the universe. Took 100 years for people to come to terms with that. Maybe more, because it would have been all the time before that. Yet I'll bet there were people on Earth who knew better, and a lot of people didn't, and we've inherited a lot of the information. Kind of like in Darwin's Origin of the Species, he used the term, apparently, if I remember correctly, 13 times survival of the fittest is what leads to a species' potential success, survival. But he used cooperation 70-something times as primary to a species' survival, and we don't talk about that. We talk about survival of the fittest, so we can justify the fight. Becomes the only thing we can do because we're looking for information to support the thinking we're doing that is incorrect. So everywhere we go, we're looking for things that support it. We don't see the rest. We only see the things that support it and think that's all there is.
Mm-hmm.
The book talks about strange mental blank spots. They're not that strange when you do them commonly and every day. What's strange is that we don't bother to mention it or think about it while we're thinking about it. We're just not thinking about it objectively enough to see it accurately enough to talk about it as something we're actually doing while we're doing it and start to dissipate it, because it will go as quickly as I'm willing to see it as it is as quickly as it never, ever feels like I'm stuck in it whatsoever. Why? Because I'm not. I'm only stuck by the ideas I have that aren't true, thinking they're true. So to create a mental block, to be a head case, to be a blockhead, isn't because that's who I am, it's what I'm thinking. I'm misusing my mentality and creating an experience I think is reality. So a depressed mentality is where depression comes from. It's not some universal cosmic thing that all of a sudden decides to land on my head, but we blame other things, other experience, some confluence of strange things that haunt us. It's haunting for me to be doing what I'm doing and think it's in the dark while I'm expressing it on a daily basis openly. That's fear. And what does it tell me whenever I feel it? That I know better and I'm witnessing my Geiger counter telling me I'm heading in a radioactive, interreactive, reactive direction. I'm going to fight for the life of that thing as long as I think it's true and real. And as a result, I'm going to fight against the life of my own experience and everyone else's, making believe it's the only thing I can do. I'm going to pick fights. And when I drive, I find plenty to complain about.
If you can find your keys.
Yes. I listened to Stephen Wright the other night, and he said, I got home one night and put my car key in the front door and started it up. And I drove the building around the block, and all the neighbors complained. So off the wall. But I mean, as a comedian, he has an uncanny way of taking apart the presumption of how we see things and seeing it in such an odd, absolutely off the wall way. But it's a relief to hear it talked about that way, because my sense is we think of it as so seriously the way we take it, that to think of it in any other way is a relief. It relieves the pressure. It gets the laughter is equal to the tears in any kind of pitiful experience or dramatic, sad experience. But I don't combine pity with sadness. But very often the self-pity is the idea that I'm not getting what I want and I'm not getting what I think I should have gotten, not so much what actually happened. I'm not even pitying and dealing with the drama of what's happened. which in the experience of death is profound for us to all of a sudden have something we've known our entire existence all of a sudden disappear. But if it's disappearing, maybe it was only appearance to begin with. Maybe how things seem and how they appear isn't how they are, but how we interpret them as being in our own thinking. We're not witnessing the substance of that thing, and it might be worth noting that there may be an essence that we're forgetting about. And my sense is, I went to a funeral once and listened to the eulogies given about this guy who I didn't know to be a very ethical guy, but he was talking, they were talking in ways about him that were far in excess of that. And I thought, once the body's gone, we're not thinking about those things, those idiosyncratic personality defects, behaviors. We're thinking about the essence of the individual. And I thought that's very interesting to come out of a funeral experience that seems to be so dramatically impossible, and yet talking about a possibility that seems to be impossible while the guy's actually alive. And I would say that's my regret. The degree to which I didn't allow that while somebody was living would be the degree to which I'm not allowing it now while we are still existing and living. I'm not giving tribute to that death and the experience and the capacity of that experience to enlighten, literally bring light to an awareness that's much greater than this limited, disintegrative physical experience that we're witnessing, the seeming physical experience, when that physical experience is based on an absolute essence. At some point, there must be something essential for us to all be doing pretty much the same thing in different ways, and not seeing the difference as a difference rather than seeing if we're doing it in different ways, that's the same. Mark, welcome. Jana.
Hi.
Anthony. So talking about this and engaging in this conversation, we can come together and reinforce the stories of woe and worry and all the stuff we do. And in my experience, if I engage in that, I'm helping people get worse. Rather than disengaging and beginning to bring an objective conversation that gives us a chance to begin to share what we naturally have, rather than what we unnaturally reinforce as being our identity, our personality, and that person that we keep taking so seriously, we wonder why we're struggling. People are often told, don't take yourself too seriously. Why would that be? Because that self is a joke imposing as reality. It isn't funny when we think it's real. It's not funny at all. I have had plenty of people in our conversation react to points that they do not talk to me anymore. They disconnected, became too much. They thought I was telling them what to do, what to think, how to think. They shouldn't be doing what they're doing. I don't know that I do that. And if I do, it's just an ill-conceived direction I take. But if we already know, and we know, and if that's accurate, doesn't matter what we think about it, it's still accurate. So like reality doesn't change because I think it's my reality or your reality. Reality stays the same while I think things that aren't reality. I'm thinking about reality as not reality.
I thought you said reality doesn't really exist a minute ago.
In what regard?
That it's only what you think of it.
No. When
You said it doesn't exist. You said reality doesn't really exist. It's just what we think of it.
When we think of reality as being what we're thinking, it doesn't really exist, because reality doesn't need us to think about it to be real. If it's essential, if it's absolute, it doesn't come and go because I think about it or don't think about it. What comes and goes is my thinking about it. We're mistaking this process we have, this analytical process. Our brain is processing information 24 hours a day. So much information that to come up with a number would be impossible because it's processing everything that's going on everywhere all the time, because the sum total of the present state of awareness is the sum total of everything that's happening for each of us. We seem to be in distinct places, but we're witnessing the totality of everything all the time. If it's all interactive and it's all absolute, then it's something we're constantly in the midst of. And I would say we're not even in the midst. We're absolutely in the knowing of it that isn't divisible, so it can't be in the midst. It is It is the mist of the ideas. It's the foggy notions don't actually cloud the sun. Like we say, the sun is not out when the clouds are out. The sun's actually out, the clouds are out. We say the sun goes down. It does not. We move away from it. We say it comes up. It does not. We move toward it. We say things according to how they seem rather than how they are. And it's not to say we can't say those things and won't continue. But to see them as reality is to be at odds with reality. And that reality, Anthony, doesn't exist because it's only what I think about reality that I'm thinking about, not actually reality. So it seems twisted, and I would assure you it is. And it seems crazy, and yes, it is. To see it accurately is to see how seriously we can take something that really is just silly. It's just a masquerade. It's like putting a mask on and looking in the mirror and asking the mirror to take the mask off because you don't like how you look. It's not going to happen. But we can think it does and stand in the mirror. And that's basically what we're doing, standing in the face of what we call reality, when in fact it's just a reflection of our own thinking that we're calling reality, and wonder why it seems to continue being so dismal in so many ways, and that we need to go out and do things that are really fun to overcome it. Constantly seeking the next adventure, but missing the entire adventure and exploration of this awareness and starting to notice it's actually natural. It's not some unnatural thing. It's not some hard thing. We've turned the easiest thing into the hardest thing and the hardest thing into the easiest thing. That's crazy. Something that does not change is as simple as it can get because it never changes. It's always the same. So to think of it in any other term is infinitely complicated to make believe it's reality because it will infinitely always fail. And that failure is actually admitting it has nothing to do with reality and everything to do with what we're thinking. So if the grace is always graceful and elegant, my thinking about it is not always graceful or elegant. It doesn't dismiss the grace or the elegance. It dismisses the thinking I'm doing and narrows down from what seems to be everything to the simple thing I'm doing in my thinking that's causing and manifesting those effects. It's kind of a big oy vey. Part of this, and maybe we can deal with this next week because I know we're coming up against our time frame. Part of this, in my experiences, was starting to see that if everything is absolute, there are no opposites. And then I realized there can be opposites, but they're also absolute. Rather than see them as opposite, what I realized is that I used to take positions, and I still do to a degree. I used to take positions and think there's no other position because I used to think my thinking was right. Now I was opposed to every other position that anyone else could take and offended when they did. Rather than see it was my position that I was taking as being reality that caused that effect. So if I'm causing an effect that's detrimental and hateful and spiteful, it may be worth noticing and seeing that when I take it, what I realize is that when I take a position, I'm confirming all those other positions can be taken by anyone who wants to take them freely. I'm not asking everyone to do what I'm doing because I'm not afraid of my thought. I'm now saying I can think whatever I want and make a choice to take a position. And it confirms all other positions. So I welcome people's choices and become unified in it because it's something we can all do. It doesn't become something distinct to me and egregious to me and an assault on me, because it's sharing the nature of the fact that we can all take positions. The fact that they're true, again, points to the idea that our thinking about things is reality, when in fact our thinking of things is the thinking we're doing of them. And if reality is reality, we don't need to think about it for it to be real, which sort of dismisses the idea that I can create my own reality. I can manifest my own effects. It isn't reality, it's just an effect I'm creating. I can call it that. I can live with it as though it is, But to live with it that way puts me at odds with reality and seems to be depressing and conflicted and all those other things. But I can also start to see that I can call it that and know it isn't that. And now I can do anything I want without the impacts of that reactiveness, which I think, Gabe, you were pointing at earlier, is how can we both be aware of this and still be doing it, and then notice that I can still be doing it and notice exactly what I'm doing and not have the impact I used to have that seems so frightful and so conflicted. It's just starting to notice that when those disturbances happen, just as the 12 and 12 says specifically, totally blanking on the thing. Whenever we are disturbed, no matter the cause, he adds in there, because he knows we're people that would discount having anything to do with it by thinking we're not the cause. No matter the cause, he's saying something is wrong with us. What's wrong is our thinking about our thinking. To be the thinker of reality is to be all that reality is. And that would certainly put us in the way of any greater spiritual reality, any greater absolute reality, any greater omnipotent, omniscient, metaphysical reality. And even the word metaphysical talks about being beyond the physical, when I would suggest that it's also in the physical. It's the essence of the physical, and it seems beyond the physical when I think the physical is all that there is, because it's beyond my imagination of the physicality that I'm experiencing. So if it's beyond, it's within. And if it's here, it's there. And if I take a position here, I'm also taking a position in relation to everything else. If I think my position is real and true, I'm taking a position that no one else should take any other position than mine. So what do? Get very concerned about what people are thinking about me. And it's not me I'm worried about, it's the thinking I'm thinking about myself that I'm worried about them thinking about accurate. Self-consciousness is defined as undue regard for appearance. Why would the consciousness of a self that was on solid, absolute, stable, knowing ground or awareness be in any doubt about itself to worry about what other people think about it or how it looks and appears? I would say it wouldn't, and doesn't. It isn't. That nature of ours has never been disconnected or not intact. It's only been thought to be. Well, we thought we were our thoughts, we thought we were in our thoughts, and as a result felt disconnected from the thinking we were doing, not from the reality we were experiencing. We wouldn't notice the disconnection if it weren't for the knowing nature of reality, giving us that chance to see the distinction between the disturbances we're creating and the reality that we're existing in.
Agreed.
Well, and the beauty is that, agree or not with something real, it stays real. And that's, I think I talked about Mark yesterday or the day before or something about that. And it may have been you yesterday, Gabe. Sometimes I get the faces and the places all merged since it's all the same thing. But the idea that we have to think about it at all is to begin to see we don't have to think about it at all for it to be real. To start to see that reality is real and always has been, no matter what we think, is to start to really see thinking as something. It's bringing it down from some universal thing that we're doing to what we're doing, and then seeing that it's having an impact universally on everything that's happening. So if I'm making a dent in the energy field by making believe matter matters only to my matter, I'm actually impacting everything that's happening everywhere with what I'm thinking. And if the impact is thinking that I have nothing to do with it, I'm thinking everything is responsible for it, rather than starting to see I am responsible for everything. So instead of being a benefit, I become a liability. Instead of being an asset, I'm a liability. Instead of being good, I'm bad. Instead of all those things start to divide and seemingly attempt to conquer what they can't. The Course in Miracles says that ego is trying to divide by conquering. Can't do it. You divide one in half, you never get to zero. You never get to the freedom of nothing, to the space of that essence that isn't a thing.
Right.
So maybe we can spend more time on the opposites next week and talk about this. And my experience is that in the talking about it that gets out of my head the limited thinking I do that when I think more about just continues to maintain and reinforce the limits. And when I talk about it, I'm subject to recognizing that other people's awareness is that same greater knowing awareness, and that thing I may discount in my own reinforcement of my own thinking becomes much more obvious to me when I start to talk about it openly. Because any of the things I'm maintaining in my thinking that I think are real and true, I'm actually aware that other people are recognizing that they're not. And it gives me a chance to actually unload and undo the thing that I might normally redo in my own seeming thinking. And eventually the intuition becomes pretty obvious because my experience, the flood of information doesn't overwhelm, it is inspired. And it's an exploration and an adventure and actually fulfilling because it's the totality of everything happening simultaneously being witnessed rather than being used as a justification to deny and divide and defy and defend and be delusional about what's happening. So the words can seem a bit wonky because I had put words to this in my own thinking, but I hadn't really talked to individuals. I hadn't talked at a group level. And when I did, I realized there was much more self-conscious of the self I thought was conscious, which gave me a chance to get a little better at talking about it, which is why the group concept started. And then the podcast is allowing people everywhere to participate and to listen. Their participation is their listening, their responses, their reactions, whatever they are. And anyone out there is welcome to participate more directly, send questions. We will answer them, work on them, talk about them, just like we do the questions that come from the people who are immediately in this discussion. Nothing will go unnoticed if you have something to say or think about or something that seems unique. And there is no obligation to add a name or any association to it. It's anonymous. You're welcome and have the freedom to talk openly, and we can talk about anything you're concerned about or thinking about as best we can and include you in that way, in a greater way. And you're also welcome to join us. It's Sunday mornings at 9:00 Pacific Standard Time. And I can make arrangements anytime. We've got 168 hours a week. I'm available. So if you'd like to do this as a one-on-one and have a discussion, we're able to do it, either recorded or not. I'm happy to do that too.
Thanks, Chuck.
My sense is this is an undiscussed aspect of life, and it's something humans have been struggling with as long as written history has been written, because self-contempt and self-indignation has been used historically to condemn, to isolate, to suppress, to oppress, and to kill people based on a thought. Probably not the highest and best use of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Jack.
It's good to see you, Lensis.
Hello,
Anthony,
Jack.
enjoy France. Jana, how's the
Thank
sunrise?
you. Au revoir.
Hello, Jana.
It's hi.
Bon
Aloha.
appetit.
Hello.
Bon appetit.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Ciao.